Hello there. Now, I'm going to talk today about church buildings and communities. Um, Basically, how the wider community feel about church buildings in their neighbourhoods. And this really follows on from the talk that I gave at last year's Regenerating Places of Faith event in 2017, during which I spoke about regenerating places in the United Kingdom. Um, Essentially, I spoke about buildings that I'd worked on as an architect in Scotland, but I also spoke about a number of buildings in case studies of buildings in Oxfordshire um, that were recorded, documented in a book by Becky Payne called Churches for Communities, the cover of which is on the left-hand side of this slide. I think the little cartoons that you remember from last year's event summarize very succinctly a lot of the issues about how church buildings can serve as community hubs in the heart of their neighbourhoods. And I think thanks to Nigel Walter of Archangel Architects, a lot of these cartoons are available in a book called Buildings for Mission, which I'd certainly recommend also. Now, if you wanted to review the presentation that I'd given it, you'll find it on YouTube if you type Regenerating Places of Faith, Ian Hamilton, and you could review that presentation from last year. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to set the context of why it's important to support the wider community. And then I'd like to go on, I'd like basically during my talk to look behind last year's case studies at how church congregations can learn more about the needs of their local communities in order to most effectively adapt their buildings to serve mission in supporting their neighbours, their neighbourhoods. And I think this slide essentially illustrates something that I personally have a deep concern about, and that it's a well-known fact that our community spirit in Australia has diminished in the last 30 or 40 years. This slide would suggest that that 70% of us no longer know who our neighbours are. We don't know our neighbours' names, and I think people are becoming much more isolated within our society, within our communities. And this is a quote by the former Shadow Assistant Treasurer Andrew Lee back in 2015, in which he said that Australia in the post-war era was a nation of joiners. We knew the names of our local baker and butcher. Half of us attended a religious service at least monthly, and many went weekly. In short, the level of social capital was high. There's little doubt it has declined since then, and on most measures Australians are less connected to each other than at any point in the post-war era. So I think that's quite a concerning situation that I think churches can help to address. Those who are becoming isolated within our communities. Now, these bullet points essentially summarize what I'd like to talk about, and what I'll go on to after this is setting the context obviously, but what I'd like to go on to do is talk about several case studies of church buildings that I'm currently working with, the church congregations in South Australia, and then I'd like to go on and look at the current situation in Tasmania before summing up at the end of this talk. Now, places of faith, just to go through these bullet points, as you can see, places of faith can be assets for the wider community benefit. By opening their doors to welcome in others, church congregations can embed themselves more in their local communities. It's really important to understand the needs of the wider community in order to align parish mission with activities that could bring real community benefit. And in welcoming the wider community, they can bring in essential revenue to help maintain church buildings. So these are the essential core points that I'm wanting to raise by going through these case studies. So the first case study is St George's Church in Gawler, one that I touched on briefly last year, and I know that Daniel's going on to talk about later in this event. But the circumstances are such that they have an older, dwindling congregation associated with St George's Parish. They have historic church buildings that are in urgent need of regeneration in a location that offers huge potential to better serve the local community, and a town within a town that is undergoing growth and redevelopment. So a number of great positives there in terms of the church's relationship and potential future. And the potential solutions, you might say, are that if there's a clear understanding of parish mission, then with outreach and compassion, the church can serve its community extremely well. But they need to better understand the local community and those needs that align with their parish mission, and to develop mutually beneficial stakeholder relationships to fulfill the needs, those needs by sharing networks, knowledge, and other resources, and essentially they need to create a vision and a business plan to help generate funding, and currently that's underway. Now you'll remember from last year's event this little diagram which I had produced in order to at the very beginning of my journey to try and assist the parish, where I had looked at all of the available facilities around the centre of Gawler, and the heart in the middle is essentially the Church of St George's, right in the middle of the most important heart of Gawler. And I suppose in order to understand where the church might best direct its activities in serving the wider community, I felt it was important to understand what kind of facilities were available throughout the city within 5 minutes walk and within 10 minutes walk. You can see down the right hand side of this slide, you can see Murray Street very clearly, the commercial heart of Gawler, but the spiritual heart is very much around about Church Hill, where St George's is central to that particular area. And what I discovered in looking at Gawler was that they have many sporting opportunities, lots of different facilities available for physical activity, but very little in the way of facilities for the heart and the soul and the mental, to help with mental health. So I certainly recommend that that's one way of starting to get a better understanding, by looking at the immediate neighbourhood around your church in order to be able to see what facilities already exist. Another very interesting snapshot that can be gained of your local area is through the census information, which is available on the website for the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And this is just a snapshot of Gawler, which gives some very basic information on the demographics of the city centre, of the town centre. But you can go much deeper. You can download any number of spreadsheets that give information on the demographics of the area and a whole range of different facts and figures about the population. And I think this is a very helpful background source of information for those trying to better understand their neighbourhoods. And another source of information which I had only just come across when I started to research this study was the research for this talk was the SA Community website, sacommunity.org, which contains a huge amount of information on community services, and this is basically the page that comes up if you were to do a search on community services in the Gawler area, and there's probably 50 or 60 different organisations and clubs and different groups that are available within the Gawler area. And I would certainly be recommending that if church congregations wanted to look at the available community services, identify perhaps a selection who might be potential stakeholders, and approach them to see whether they would be willing, or whether there's any need by those organisations to have a base within the church. They could certainly become potential stakeholders working within the community alongside the church. So that's certainly another source of information. Now, I'm not going to spend more time. I'm going to move on to case study 2, which is St Barnabas in Croydon. Now, this is a young and growing congregation. Again, they're in an historic church building, or a number of buildings, in fact, which are in urgent need of regeneration. They are in a location that offers huge potential to better serve their local community, because it's in a suburb that's undergoing growth and redevelopment, and has a lack of social facilities. And again, here there's a clear understanding. In order to come up with a satisfactory understanding about the local community and how to serve it, we've spoken with the church about gaining a clear understanding, firstly of that church congregation's parish mission, and then to gain a better understanding of the local community and those needs that align with the parish mission, and once again to develop mutually beneficial stakeholder relationships and create a vision to help generate funding. And again, this is a church congregation that's just beginning this journey. And this is a slide from Becky Payne's book that relates to one of those churches in Oxfordshire that I spoke about last year, and it really shows the depth of research that particular congregation went into in their neighbourhood, looking at a whole range of different needs and aspirations and demographics in relation to their local neighbourhood. And this really demonstrates something of the kind of in-depth research that's required to gain a good grasp of where the needs may be. And I spoke to Ben Wood, who's the minister at St Barnabas, and had suggested that if his congregation were to get a better understanding and to embed themselves more thoroughly within their neighbourhood, it would be a good idea if they could get out and perhaps even doorstep neighbours and ask a range of questions about the kind of facilities their neighbours would like to see within their local church building, and gain some sense of how the neighbours felt about their particular neighbourhood church building. And I was very, very much heartened by the fact that Ben had taken it upon himself to draft up this really quite detailed questionnaire, and he'd taken this questionnaire around a neighbourhood event some weeks ago, and he'd presented it to a variety of different people at the event, and asked them to fill the questionnaire out. And this really gives, he'd only approached 54. Well, he'd approached a range of people, but he got 54 people who completed the questionnaire, and I think the results were really very interesting. 81% of those people who filled the questionnaire were interested in movie nights. a similar number in music concerts. A large number of were very keen on community fetes, a cafe, quiz nights, and so on. You can read the figures for yourself. So it really demonstrated a genuine interest amongst the wider community for activities that might take place within their church. I think most telling was Ben had said that he'd asked a number of people who were in the neighbourhood but non-worshippers, how would they feel if their church was to be demolished, and they were appalled at the very idea of losing an historic church building within their neighbourhood, even though they didn't worship there. So I think it shows the depth of passion that people have for their heritage, their neighbourhood heritage. And I'm just going to go on and talk about what I'm calling the case study 3, which is really in relation to potential church closures in Tasmania. I have in recent months got to know the registrar of the Anglican Diocese of Tasmania, and as many of you will know from the media, the Anglican Church in Tasmania have been going through a very difficult phase, whereby they had identified a range of churches, particularly in rural areas, that did not appear to be sustainable, and had suggested that some of those churches may need to close. And it's caused a huge amount of it's led to a huge amount of angst and unhappiness amongst both communities and church congregations, and I felt there was something to learn from the kind of reactions that we've seen in Tasmania. So I'd rung up James and had quite a long talk with him to try and get a better understanding of the issues relating to these potential church closures. So really the circumstances are that we have a church organisation that's managing change on a broad scale, of a wide variety of struggling churches, financial difficulties due to the need to pay for national redress, and potentially many church buildings that may be lost to local communities, and therefore strongly emotive issues, especially within rural communities. Now, the principal issues that the registrar had mentioned were in relation to family continuity, because even families that no longer worshipped were quite passionate about their local church buildings. James actually mentioned one particular family who, for generation upon generation, had been christened at a particular rural church on Tasmania, and that church had closed for worship several years ago, and it was not the policy of the Anglican Church to hold christenings at churches that were no longer places used for worship. So when this family approached the Anglican Church to have a baby christened, they were not able or willing to do that, and that family were extremely upset because they'd lost that continuity of history and spirituality within their family. There was also an appreciation throughout all of these potential issues of closure. There was an understanding amongst communities of the heritage importance and the streetscape value of their church buildings. Many villages and towns within Tasmania had grown up around their church buildings, and so to potentially lose them was conceived as a big issue. And they were focal points for communities, for people who wanted to gather for meetings and so on, and there were, I think what I remember James saying was that during funerals and, I mean, obviously the big focal points in church buildings, notwithstanding regular worship, the big focal points would be christenings, weddings, and funerals. That during funerals, which in rural areas can be very big, very well attended events by the wider community, that the focus of grief was around about the churchyard during burial, and the focus of community celebration of people's lives, the lives of the deceased, focused around the church buildings, and these are extremely important issues, particularly in rural communities. And the last thing, which was interesting, was honour boards. Honour boards for those who had died in action in the First and Second World Wars, and how there was a concern that those honour boards would be lost within church buildings if they were to fall into private hands. So, the last issue that I discussed with James is this curious issue of philanthropy. People have been making offers to buy church buildings, and these can be split into a number of different categories, according to James. There were the faith-motivated benefactors, people who have a faith, who don't necessarily have any association with Tasmania, but feel concerned for those of faith on the island who may lose their churches, so have been offering to buy church buildings to help support strangers on Tasmania, because they have a strong sense of faith, and then the second category are people on the mainland with present or past family connections with the island, people who just basically want to give something back by helping to buy a property for a church congregation or for a wider community. And finally, there are the local Tasmanian communities, the wider communities within around church buildings, who are organising to buy their local churches to maintain them. So there are a variety of different philanthropic issues coming out of that whole situation in Tasmania. Now, if you remember from last year, this is a book that I'd highlighted, which I was very interested in when I first came across it, and it was written, or was published rather, in 1986 to commemorate 150 years of churches in South Australia. And I've very subtly changed the title there. You can see it, because I genuinely feel that that Adelaide and South Australia, the wider South Australia, have many tired church buildings, and my passionate desire is that by the 200th anniversary of the establishment of South Australia in 2036, that by that stage we have some time to achieve it, but within the next 18 years or so, it would be wonderful if we could regenerate the places of faith that we have, the fantastic heritage of churches that we have in South Australia, to once again by 2036 have a proud legacy of historic church buildings. So let's fix it for 36 is the title that I'd come up with for that bold proposal. Now, just to conclude, I think we all many of us feel that our churches can be isolated within their communities, but I think few of us have a church that's quite as isolated as this one. This is in Western Georgia, in the former Soviet Union, in the Imereti region, and this church sits on the top of a 40-meter tall pillar of stone, and it's part of a little monastery up there. And this gentleman climbing the ladder that you can see the arrow pointing at, this gentleman is on his way to church. And I think while some of us can feel isolated, I don't think anybody can feel quite the same sense of isolation as this gentleman is feeling on his way to church. So thank you for listening.